Beowulf, anonymously written, translated by Burton Raffel, chapter 27. Then the band of Geats, young and brave, marching in their ring-locked armor, reached the shore. The coast guard saw them coming and about to go as he'd seen them before. He hurried down the hillside, whipping his horse, but this time shouted no challenge, told them only how the Geats would be watching too, and would welcome such warriors in shining mail. Their broad-beamed ship lay bobbing at the edge of the sand. They loaded it high with armor and horses and all the rich treasure it could hold. The mast stood high and straight, over heaped up wealth, Hrothgar's and now theirs. Beowulf rewarded the boat's watchman, who had stayed behind, with a sword that had hammered gold wound on its handle. The weapon brought him honor. Then the ship left shore, left Denmark, traveled through deep water. Deck timbers creaked, and the wind, billowing through the sail, stretched from the mast, tied tight with ropes, did not hold them back, did not keep the ring-proud ship from foaming swiftly through the waves, the sea currents, across the wide ocean, until they could see familiar headlands, cliffs that sprang out of Geatish soil. Driven by the wind, the ship rammed high on the shore. Harbor guards came running to greet them, men who for days had waited and watched for their beloved comrades to come crossing the waves. They anchored the high-bowed ship, moored it close to the shore where the booming sea could not pull it loose and lead it away. Then they carried up the golden armor, the ancient swords, the jewels, brought them to Hygelac's home, their ring-giver's hall near the sea, where he lived surrounded by his followers. He was a famous king, with a fitting high hall and a wife Hygd, young but wise and knowing beyond her years. She was Hareth's daughter, a noble queen with none of the niggardly ways of women like Thrith. Hygd gave the Geats gifts with open hands, but Thrith was too proud, an imperious princess with a vicious tongue, and so fierce and wild that her father's followers averted their eyes when she passed, knowing that if anyone but the king watched where she walked, her hands would shape a noose to fit their necks. She would lie. Her father's lieutenants would write out her warrants, and he who had stared would end his life on the end of an ancient sword. And how great a sin for a woman, whether fair or black, to create fear and destruction. For a woman who should walk in the ways of peace, to kill with pretended insults. But Hemming's kinsman tamed her. His hall guest told a different story, spread the news that Thrith had forgotten her gory tricks. Once her wise father had sent her to a wedding with Offa, married her to that brave young warrior, sent her across the yellow-green sea to that gold-adorned champion, a fierce fighter in war or peace. They praised her now for her generous heart and her goodness and the high and most noble paths she walked, filled with adoring love for that leader of warriors, her husband. He was a man as brave and strong and good, it is said, as anyone on this earth. A spear-bold soldier who knew no fear, exalted with gifts, victorious in war, a king who ruled his native land wisely and well. Emer was his son, Hemming's kinsman, Garmund's grandson, a powerful swordsman, and his warrior's shield. 28. Then Beowulf and his men went walking along the shore, down the broad strip of sand. The world's bright candle shone, hurrying up from the south. It was a short journey from their ship to Hygelac's home, to the hall where their king, Ongentho's killer, lived with his warriors and gave treasures away. They walked quickly. The young king knew they were back, Beowulf and his handful of brave men, come safely home. He sat now, waiting to see them, to greet his battle comrades when they arrived at his court. They came, and when Beowulf had bowed to his lord, and standing in front of the throne had solemnly spoken loyal words, Hygelac ordered him to sit at his side. He who had survived sailed home victorious next to his kinsman and king. Mead cups were filled, and Hereth's daughter took them through the hall, carried ale to her husband's comrades. Hygelac, unable to stay silent, anxious to know how Beowulf's adventure had gone, began to question him, courteous, but eager to be told everything. "Beloved Beowulf, tell us of your trip to far-off places. Brought you your sudden expedition on the salty waves, your search for war in Heret? Did you end Hrothgar's hopeless misery? Could you help that glorious king? Grendel's savagery lay heavy on my heart, but I was afraid to let you go to him. For a long time I held you here, kept you safe, forced you to make the Danes fight their own battles. God be praised that my eyes have beheld you once more unharmed." Beowulf spoke, Ecgtheow's brave son. "My lord Hygelac, my meeting with Grendel and the nighttime battle we fought are known to everyone in Denmark, where the monster was once the uncrowned ruler, murdering and eating Hrothgar's people, forever bringing them misery. I ended his reign, avenged his crime so completely in the crashing darkness that not even the boldest of his kind will ever boast, lying in sin and deceit, that the monster beat me. I sought out Hrothgar first, came to him in his hall. When Heathdane's famous son heard that I'd come to challenge Grendel, he gave me a seat of honor alongside his son. His followers were drinking, I joined their feast, sat with that band as bright and loud-tongued as any I've ever seen. His famous queen went back and forth, hurrying the cup-bearing boys, giving bracelets and rings to her husband's warriors. I heard the oldest soldiers of all calling for ale from Hrothgar's daughter's hands, and Freya was the way they greeted her when she gave them the golden cups. And Hrothgar will give her to Ingeld, gracious Froda's son. She and that ripening soldier will be married. The Danes' great lord and protector has declared, hoping that his quarrel with the Hathobards can be settled by a woman. He's wrong. How many wars have been put to bed in a prince's bed? Few. A bride can bring a little peace, make spears silent for a time, but not long. Ingeld and all his men will be drinking in the hall when the wedding is done and Freya is his wife. The Danes will be wearing gleaming armor and ring-marked old swords, and the prince and his people will remember those treasures, will remember that their fathers once wore them, fell with those helmets on their heads, those swords in their hands. Chapter 29. And seeing their ancestral armor and weapons, Ingeld and his followers will be angry. And one of his soldiers, sitting with ale in his cup and bitterness in his heart, will remember war and death. And while he sits and drinks, his sharp old tongue will begin to tempt some young warrior, pushing and probing for a new war. "Hey, that sword, that precious old blade over there. I think you know it, friend. Your father carried it, fought with it the last time he could swing a sword. The Danes killed him, and many more of our men, and stripped the dead bodies, the brave, bold Danes. One of the princess's people here now might be the murderer's son, boasting about his treasures, his ancient armor, which ought to be yours by right. Bitter words will work in a hot-tempered brain, pushing up thoughts of the past. And then, when he can, calling his father's name, the youngster will kill some innocent Dane, a servant, and bloody sword in hand will run from the hall, knowing his way through the woods. But war will begin as he runs, to the sound of broken oaths, and its heat will dry up Ingeld's heart, leave him indifferent to his Danish bride. Hrothgar may think the Hathobards love him, loving Frau. But the friendship can't last. The vows are worthless. But of Grendel, you need to know more to know everything. I ought to go on. It was early in the evening. Heaven's jewel had slid to its rest, and the jealous monster planning murder came seeking us out, stalking us as we guarded Hrothgar's hall. Hondshoe, sleeping in his armor, was the first Geat he reached. Grendel seized him, tore him apart, swallowed him down, feet and all, as fate had decreed. A glorious young soldier killed in his prime. Yet Grendel had only begun his bloody work, meant to leave us with his belly and his pouch both full, and Herit half empty. Then he tested his strength against mine, hand to hand. His pouch hung at his side, a huge bag sewn from a dragon's skin, worked with a devil's skill. It was closed by a marvelous clasp. The monster intended to take me, put me inside, save me for another meal. He was bold and strong, but once I stood on my feet, his strength was useless, and it failed him. The whole tale, Chapter 30, of how I killed him, repaid him in kind for all the evil he'd done, would take too long. Your people, my prince, were honored in the doing. He escaped, found a few minutes of life, but his hand, his whole right arm, stayed in Herit. The miserable creature crept away, dropped to the bottom of his lake, half dead as he fell. When the sun had returned, the Danes' great king poured out treasure, repaid me in hammered gold for the bloody battle I'd fought in his name. He ordered a feast. There were songs and the telling of tales. One ancient Dane told of long dead times. And sometimes Hrothgar himself, with the harp in his lap, stroked its silvery strings and told wonderful stories. A brave king reciting unhappy truths about good and evil. And sometimes he wove his stories on the mournful thread of old age, remembering buried strength and the battles it had won. He would weep, the old king, wise, with many winters, remembering what he'd done once, what he'd seen, what he knew. And so we sat the day away, feasting. Then darkness fell again, and Grendel's mother was waiting, ready for revenge, hating the Danes for her son's death. The monstrous hag succeeded, burst boldly into Herit, and killed Escher, one of the king's oldest, wisest soldiers. But when the sun shone once more, the death-weary Danes could not build a pyre and burn his beloved body, lay him on flaming logs, return ashes to dust. She'd carried away his corpse, brought it to her den deep in the water. Hrothgar had wept for many of his men, but this time his heart melted. This was the worst. He begged me in your name, half weeping as he spoke, to seek still greater glory deep in the swirling waves, to win still higher fame, and the gifts he would give me down in the surging lake, I sought and fought her. The horrible hag, fierce and wild, we fought, clutching and grasping. The water ran red with blood, and at last, with a mighty sword that had hung on the wall, I cut off her head. I had barely escaped with my life. My death was not written. And the Danes' protector, Healfdene's great son, heaped up treasures and precious jewels to reward me. Chapter 31. He lived his life as a good king must. I lost nothing. None of his gifts my strength could have earned me. He opened his store of gems and honor, let me choose as I liked, so I could bring his riches to you, my ruler, and prove his friendship and my love. Your favor still governs my life. I have almost no family, Hygelac, almost no one now but you. Then Beowulf ordered them to bring in the boar-head banner, the towering helmet, the ancient silvery armor, and the gold-carved sword. This war gear was Hrothgar's reward, my gift from his wise old hands. He wanted me to tell you, first, whose treasures these were. Hroðgar had owned them, his older brother, who was king of Denmark until death gave Hrothgar the throne. But Hroðgar kept them, would not give them to Herward, his brave young son, though the boy had proved his loyalty. These are yours. May they serve you well. And after the gleaming armor, 4 horses were led in, 4 bays, swift and all alike. Beowulf had brought his king horses and treasure, as a man must. Not weaving nets of malice for his comrades, preparing their death in the dark with secret cunning tricks. Hygelac trusted his nephew, leaned on his strength in war, each of them intent on the other's joy. And Beowulf gave Wealhtheow's gift, her wonderful necklace, to Hygelac's queen, and gave her also 3 supple, graceful, saddle-bright horses. She received his presents, then wore that wonderful jewel on her breast. So Ecgtheow's son proved himself, did as a famous soldier must do if glory is what he seeks, not killing his comrades in drunken rages, his heart not savage, but guarding God's gracious gift, his strength, using it only in war, and then using it bravely. And yet as a boy he was scorned. The Geats considered him worthless. When he sat in their mead hall and their lord was making men rich, he held no claim on the king's goodwill. They were sure he was lazy, noble, but slow. The world spun round. He was a mighty warrior, more famous than any, and all the insults were wiped out. Then Hygelac, protector of his people, brought in his father's, Beowulf's grandfather's, great sword, worked in gold. None of the Geats could boast of a better weapon. He laid it in Beowulf's lap, then gave him 7,000 hides of land, houses and ground and all. Geatland was home for both king and prince. Their fathers had left them buildings and fields, but Hygelac's inheritance stretched further, and it was he who was king and was followed. Afterwards, in the time when Hygelac was dead, and Herdred, the son who'd ruled the Geats after his father, had followed him into darkness, killed in battle with the Swedes, who smashed his shield, cut through the soldiers surrounding their king. Then, when Hygd's one son was gone, Beowulf ruled in Geatland, took the throne he'd refused once, and held it long and well. He was old, with years and wisdom, 50 winters a king, when a dragon awoke from its darkness and dreams and brought terror to his people. The beast had slept in a huge stone tower with a hidden path beneath. A man stumbled on the entrance, went in, discovered the ancient treasure, the pagan jewels and gold the dragon had been guarding, and dazzled and greedy, stole a gem-studded cup and fled. But now the dragon hid nothing, neither the theft nor itself. It swept through the darkness, and all Geatland knew its anger.